I think everyone listening to this broadcast understands by now that we are living in a war-torn world. Let me give you some statistics on the refugee crisis going on in the world right now. 11 million people, according to the New York Times, 11 million people were uprooted by violence last year. Most of them were displaced by conflicts in Syria, in Iraq, and then in Ukraine and Afghanistan. So overall, we now have a world in which 38 million people are displaced inside their own countries, and 16.7 million people are refugees living in foreign countries. Now, Syria and Iraq, as we mentioned, are key flashpoints for this war and refugee crisis. This week, we learned that, as the New York Times put it, in a major shift of focus in the battle with the Islamic State, the Obama administration is planning to establish a new military base in Anbar province and send 400 American military trainers, so-called, to help retake the city of Ramadi. Here to help us make sense of that latest development is Stephen Miles. He is advocacy director of the group Win Without War. He is been on the program before. We're always delighted to have him. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks. We're happy to be here, RJ.
We're happy to have you. Now, listen, okay, so what's the meaning? We've talked before about the kind of morass we found ourselves in Iraq and Syria, which I guess in terms of the Islamic State is now a single war in many ways. What's the meaning of this latest development in your view?
Well, I mean, I think the simplest way to think about it is you're watching mission creep in action. This step is just one more step down the slippery slope to a larger escalation. We have a number of folks here in Washington openly pushing now for a massive re-escalation of American involvement directly on the ground, calling for 10,000 or more troops to be sent into Iraq, probably 10,000 troops into Syria as well. And unfortunately, what we see is one more step down this path of trying to solve this conflict militarily on the backs of the U.S. military. The reality, unfortunately, is that this isn't going to change anything. I published an op-ed today in USA Today and pointed out we've been bombing Iraq for nearly 25 years right now. At some point, we have to admit that you don't get peace and stability by bombing a country.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, but what I think a lot of people of goodwill in this country, good folks who want to keep things balanced, are struggling with at this point is they understand. I think a lot of people understand that we created this mess. We destabilized the nation of Iraq. We created the opportunity for ISIS to arise. I think a lot of people applauded that college student who told Jeb Bush, your brother created ISIS, and so on. But I think along with that, for a lot of people, they feel a sense of obligation to do something. And it seems like the doing something in this case is somehow to help try to retake a province that has fallen to ISIS. Also, people are obviously frightened and disturbed by the barbarity of the ISIL fighters. So they feel, well, don't we have to do something? And isn't this kind of along the lines of the something we have to do?
Well, I mean, let's take a step back and acknowledge that we are all horrified by ISIS. The brutality and the savagery we're seeing rightly shocks our conscience. But I've said it before, and I'll say it again, the first thing you do when you find yourself in a hole is that you stop digging. The underlying conflict, the one that is not just about the 30 or 40,000 fighters that ISIS has under its control, but about the 30 or 40 million people in Iraq and Syria, is a much broader crisis whose roots are not simply the brutality of ISIS, but are much larger sectarian divisions, are much larger political crises. The isolation of the Sunni community, both from the governments in Baghdad and Damascus, is what fuels ISIS's ability. They're just a cancer on the region that is able to gain power by the underlying conflict. And as long as those conflicts are going on, there is no amount of bombs that we can drop that's going to defeat them. The reality that we've seen over the last couple months the nearly 10 months we've been bombing now, is that quite literally ISIS has been able to recruit fighters faster than we've been able to kill them. That's not a recipe for defeating them. That's a recipe for decades and decades of more conflict.
Do we understand, we're talking with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War. Do we understand the mechanism that is allowing, or I'm sure it's complex, but the forces that are allowing ISIS to recruit at such a rapid pace? And I guess what I'm driving at is, Are we exacerbating the situation, and either through bombing or other American actions, are we actually helping them recruit?
Well, I think two things. One, first and foremost, absolutely. Our actions are a source of recruitment for them. The ability of ISIS to prey off of the feeling in the Sunni community, the feeling in the Sunni community that they're at war against Shiites, and that more importantly, the West is on the side of the Shia, and that they can prey on that for drawing international recruits. It's absolutely help adding fuel to this fire. But the bigger point I want to make here is that the complexities involved here are astronomical. You know, there's a great quote from Robert McNamara in Errol Morris's great movie The Fog of War about the complexity involved in insurgencies and the complexity involved in war, and that there's just so many permutations that we can never actually fully comprehend them. Add into that a society that even after fighting there all these years, we don't fully understand. Tribal allegiances, sectarian allegiances, allegiances that of all sorts of other stripes that shift sometimes by the hour on the battlefield. This is something that Washington is never going to be able to understand fully. The reality is that the people on the ground, the people who live in these villages, who live in these cities, the people who govern from Damascus and Baghdad and the provincial capitals, they're going to be the ones who have to lead on the solutions because they're going to be the ones who have to live under the solutions. And we keep trying to impose these solutions that don't work for them, and we keep being shocked when they violently resist the outcome.
Now, if that is in fact the case, and I certainly, as you know, tend to agree with you, what do we say to those well-meaning Americans who say, I was never for this war, but gosh, we have to do something? What then, for us as Americans, is the something?
Well, I think the first thing we have to remember is that the road to military quagmire is paved with good intentions. Our desire to do good in these situations, our desire to save lives, to help end these conflicts is incredibly well-meaning, and we do want to acknowledge that. It's one of the things that I love about this country is that we not only have a sense of wanting to do well by one another, but also wanting to do well and spread our values and protect human rights around the globe. But we have to ask ourselves if that's what the consequence of our actions are. And you said, what should we be doing? Well, it has to start with stopping what we're doing that's counterproductive. And then it has to start with looking at all of the alternatives, some of which are going to take some time, some of which are none of which are as easy and satisfying as dropping a bomb. But things like regional diplomacy that is going to get to the root causes, going to bring both Saudi Arabia and Iran to the table, looking at the illicit financial flows that are fueling this, looking at the climate change that is fueling this. Let's not forget the conflict in Syria started in no small part due to the loss of water and desertification that drove people into cities and destabilized the country. So there's a lot of deeper causes here. We can be doing more on all those. But one of the things we can most immediately be doing is, you started off by talking about the humanitarian crisis. There's just one example. The World Food Program is a program that helps feed people who are refugees from these crises. They're out of money. They're broke. Meanwhile, we're spending $9 million a day on the military campaign. We should ask ourselves, is that $9 million going to kill more people than are going to be recruited by the fact that ISIS can offer them food and the UN and the international community can't because their funds are broke? We need to be fully funding and working with the international community to fully fund human life-saving resources like the World Food Program and other humanitarian efforts.
So I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, Stephen Miles, you're the advocacy director of Win Without War. So many of us speak up against foolish military interventions, but it's your job. And I'm wondering, as I listen to you, whether, particularly those of us in the United States, whether we need to appeal to our own culture a little differently. I mean, we focus on, and rightfully so, what we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be continuing these counterproductive military interventions. But I'm wondering, given, I'm thinking out loud here, which can be dangerous on the air, but I'm wondering, given that we are, and I love that you said you love that about the American people, given that we are kind of doers by nature as a culture, we want to get in and do something. I'm wondering if we shouldn't be campaigning more on the idea of what we can do rather than just what we shouldn't be doing. I'm wondering if we shouldn't be out there saying we should be airdropping food, we should be convening gatherings of people to talk about options, or, I'm sure there are a dozen things I'm not thinking of, but I'm wondering if a sort of can-do peace movement might be a good idea.
Sure. I think that's definitely part of it, but I do think it's important that we struggle and we confront that part of ourselves that thinks that we need to have the answer to every question, or that we can have the answer to question. Look, you and I don't live in Iraq or Syria. We're not the ones who are going to have to live with the consequences of whatever future it is they choose. We need to be doing more to be listening to Iraqi and Syrian voices. That's not saying you sit down and negotiate with ISIS. No one is saying that. But there are 20 million Sunnis living between Damascus and Baghdad. The vast majority of them want to live in peace. They want to have a peaceful future. They just want to be safe and secure. But yet, if you hear this conversation in Washington, they are literally never represented. The only thing you have is a bunch of old white retired generals talking about whether we should be bombing them more, bombing them less. That's not a conversation about what the future of Iraq and Syria is going to be. That's a conversation that needs to be led in large part by Iraq and Syrians, and we need to do a little bit better of a job listening and a little bit less of the time, spend less time trying to impose solutions on the region.
I agree with that, and I would add to you this observation as well. That's only not a conversation about the future of Iraq and Syria. It's not a conversation about the future of the United States. It's not a conversation about the things we need to do to rebuild the middle class, to eliminate poverty, to educate young people. In other words, all the things we could be doing with the money we're pouring into the military, industrial, and national security complex. So last, I guess, theme or question for you, Stephen, what else can we be doing to change the conversation?
Well, I think we need to be demanding a couple of things. One thing we can absolutely do is that we need to demand that our elected officials in Congress have this debate. We're having, in some ways, this policy debate in the media. You and I are talking, and this conversation similarly is happening on other programs. But the one place it's not happening is the halls of Congress. The United States Congress has been woefully derelict in its duty of weighing in on this war. We've now got 3,500 men and women in uniform. By the way, about 7,000 U.S. contractors over in the region. But we haven't had yet a debate on the floor, on the floor of either chamber of Congress about this. It's up to us to demand that our elected officials do that. The second thing is we need to be demanding that, again, the United States address the humanitarian crisis. Chris Murphy, senator from Connecticut, has been leading the charge on things like this. We need to be demanding full funding of programs like the World Food Program. And then we need to be asking folks in the media, why are they not including a more diverse set of voices? If you turn on the Sunday talk shows, if you watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox, you're going to see the same folks primarily who got us into Iraq talking about what we should do in Iraq once again. They got it wrong last time. Let's demand that the media put other voices on the air this time.
Well, I think that is a good summary of what we ought to be doing. And I do have to say in conclusion, Stephen, that, if you read the history of our major military interventions of the last 500 years or re-escalations and so on, they always seem to start with 400 advisors, 200 advisors, 450 advisors. And sometimes they go frightening places if the people don't speak up. So we're glad you're speaking up, and we thank you for coming on the program.
That's right. Thanks so much, and have a good weekend, RJ.
You too. We've been speaking with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director for Win Without War, and we will be right back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.